Hello my friends, welcome to another video at the Lulu Blue Studio. My name is Luisa and today we are going to paint these peonies, these yellow peonies and these pink cherry blossoms. In particular, we are going to learn how to add all of these layers to the petals. So are you ready? Let's start. I'm going to start to create these yellow flowers that are going to be my peonies by mixing on the color palette with a filbert brush in size 10 a little bit of yellow. This is yellow lemon dip with a little bit of orange that I already have on the color palette. And then using the side and the belly of this brush, I started to create the inner petals of these peonies. These peonies have large petals, in general of round shape, and therefore I started to create the first layer with a very light sort of color that I have on the color palette and onto the brush. So this means that there is a higher concentration of water compared to the amount of pigment that I have on the brush. This color is a color with a very light value. I started creating these petals in round shape. I don't need to be too precise because I'm going to add more definitions when I'm going to build the layers on top afterwards. And so for now I just created this round shape. I'm going to leave a round white center for the disc that I'm going to create afterwards. And with this very light value of yellow, I keep creating now the outer petals of this peony. The outer petals are created in a very loose style, so just by creating these short brush strokes all around the inner petals that I've created. And I use a lighter value compared to the center. So the center has a little bit of wet on wet, where some darker areas of more concentrated yellow ochre and yellow lemon dip are concentrated and are blending through the wet on wet technique, while these outer petals are in lighter value and are much more light with less bleedings overall. While the inner petals are still wet, and the same happens for the outer petals, I started to add some more concentrated yellow ochre and yellow lemon dip to give definitions through the wet on wet technique to these petals. I usually like to add these more concentrated brush strokes where I imagine my petals to be. So these brush strokes give a definition to the shapes of the petals. I start basically creating a very first, very light in value layer, and then I keep adding additional layers on top, and these additional layers are darker in value, or sometimes I also even change completely the color overall, and I keep building definitions of these petals with these darker brush strokes on top. Sometimes the brush strokes can be added also through the wet on dry technique, and this is what we are going to do as well in this composition. In this moment I am adding a second peony in the same color, so it's a yellow peony in the upper part of the page. I start creating the inner petals of this peony in a very light value of this yellow color. And I don't need to be too precise. I just created these petals in a general round shape, and as I did for the first peony, I remember to keep the center of this peony empty, so I will fill it in a second moment. I use different color values, so I do not have a lot of pigment onto my brush, and therefore these brush strokes are going to be very, very light. And then through the wet on wet technique, I remember to add, where the paint is still wet, a few brush strokes that are more concentrated in color, and then I allow these brush strokes to blend with the underneath layer that I've just created. I'm trying to give more dimension to these petals through the wet on wet technique, and I try to add these brush strokes where I imagine the shape of my petals to be defined. In this moment, I'm mixing a little bit of magenta in my color palette, and I add a little bit of blue, this is the Cobalt Blue, to start to create a few cherry blossoms. To create the cherry blossoms, I still use this filbert brush, and I basically press on the paper the whole belly and the whole shape of this brush to create sort of round shapes all over the page. In this case in particular, I imagine these cherry blossoms to be connected through a branch that I'm going to create at a second stage. Therefore, I keep in mind where to place in particular these cherry blossoms. I remember to change the color value in the same way as I did for the peonies in order to have different color values of this magenta color mixed with a little bit of blue. And sometimes I change the color hue as well. This means that I change the color that I'm using, and I obtain this mixing different percentages, different amounts of magenta and blue, cobalt blue. Through the wet technique, I allow some of these magenta and blue color to blend with this first layer that is still wet, and I keep refining the shapes and where I want to position some of these cherry blossoms. When I'm satisfied with the overall painting, the first layer of this painting so far, I take a round shape brush. This is a brush in size 12, so it's quite thick. And I mix on my color palette a little bit of burnt umber with a little bit of yellow ochre. I obtain this sort of brown, and I add a little bit of black to give a little bit more intensity. With the tip of my brush, I start to create a few lines that resemble the branches that will pass through all of these cherry blossoms, the first layer of the cherry blossoms I've created. Since the cherry blossoms are going to be still wet, when I touch with the brown of the brush these cherry blossoms, some of the brown mixture is going to blend with the magenta mixture of the first layer of the flowers. This is going to create some beautiful blending effects between these two colors that I find really lovely to be mixed together. I'm using just the fine tip of this round brush, and I also remember to leave some white space between these lines that represent the branches I'm creating. The white of the page, of the paper, will in fact help the observer to look at these flowers and understand that these are branches that are connecting all of these flowers. I keep adding a little bit of black, this is Mars Black, and this will allow some of the branches to appear deeper in color, a little bit darker. Since the brown underneath is still wet, when I add these few brush strokes in black color, in Mars Black, this Mars Black color is going to blend with the underneath brown, and you will not really notice this very dark color, but it will give the effect that anyway these branches have different shades and dimensions. With the same brush, I started to mix a little bit of green on the color palette. This is mainly Sap Green and a little bit of green that I have left from our paintings. And I just start with a very thin tip of this brush to create the stems of the two flowers, the two peonies. I then create these leaves of the peonies by pressing and releasing the pressure from the belly of this round brush until the tip is touching the paper. I keep in mind to change the color hue and the color value of these leaves, and so I remove part of the pigment in the cup of water and I add some more concentrated sap green in the wet first layer of the leaves, and I add leaves where I see there is some white space onto the page. While I'm adding these leaves, I'm allowing the first layer of paint, that is the paint of the peonies and of the cherry blossoms, to dry. This is perfect because when the paint is going to be completely dry, I will want to start to add a second layer of paint to add more dimension and definition. At this point, I notice that there is still an area where I can add one cherry blossom, so this is what I'm doing before starting to add additional layers. Now that the first layer for the peonies, the cherry blossoms and the leaves is ready, I take the round brush in size 12 and I mix on my palette a little bit of yellow ochre with the yellow that I already had, and I started to create the second layer on the peony. I start from the lower peony and I use the side and the belly of my brush to create these patches that are a little bit darker than the first layer, that are placed in areas where it will give you the impression some petals are covered in more shadow. Sometimes I use just the tip of the brush and sometimes just the belly of the brush. The tip of the brush when I want to create a very fine line and brush strokes, or I just want to touch and let some of the color to blend into the second layer that is still wet. I instead use the belly of the brush when I wanted to create larger, let's say, patches of these darker colors. I am trying to define with this second layer the petals, the outer and the inner petals of this peony. Some of the brush strokes on the second layer are very translucent, are very, very light in color value. This means that the amount of water is much higher compared to the amount of pigment that I have on the brush. And I like to do so because I can build these layers starting from the lighter color values and then adding darker color values the more layers I create. In fact, as we said, even the first layer was created with a very light color value, but I use generally also quite light color values also when I am adding onto the second layer. And then I also like sometimes to add onto this second layer that is quite light, while this second layer is still wet, a few brush strokes just with the tip of the brush that are much more concentrated and sometimes even darker. For these yellow peonies, I am mainly using a mixture of yellow lemon dip and yellow ochre in different percentages. When I'm satisfied with the first peony, I proceed with the same technique for the second peony. And I start using a concentrated amount of yellow ochre and a round brush to create these additional layers that highlight the shape of the petals. Do not worry if sometimes you think that some of the brush strokes of your second layers are too dark. Remember that you can remove part of the pigment that you have in the cup of water, and just mainly using a little bit of water from your brush, you can go back where the patches are too dark and you can create a more translucent sort of layer. I keep in mind that all of these petals are leading to the same center of this peony, and therefore also the second layer that I'm building in this moment have brush strokes that lead to the center. Usually when I add this second layer, my hand doesn't add a lot of pressure onto the paper. I try to be quite light and to sometimes go over the same spots different times in order to create the effect that I want to achieve. When also the second peony is ready, I take my mop brush and I start to build layers on the cherry blossoms. I'm using a different technique for the cherry blossoms because I want to make sure that I stay quite loose. So I prefer to use a mop brush in this case to build layers on these pink flowers. In particular, I will use the tip of this mop brush, which is quite soft compared to the round brush, to give the impression that these cherry blossoms have ruffled edges. So I create a few C shapes and I just touch with the tip of the brush the paper to add these very short brush strokes. It's very important at this point to remember to change the color values and the color use of the colors we are using to add and build the second layer. I'm using mainly, in this case, a mixture of magenta with a little bit of cobalt blue, but I also add a little bit of red, like Scarlet Lake, to give some brush strokes that really pop up from the pink cherry blossoms. When I add this second layer on the cherry blossoms, I keep my hand very light. I do not add a lot of pressure. I define better the shape of these cherry blossoms, but I also add in the inner part of the cherry blossom a few brush strokes to define these ruffled edges. If you don't have a mop brush, you can also achieve a similar result with a round brush, with a very fine tip of a round brush. I just have the feeling that the round brush is a perfect brush for more precise brush strokes, and the mop brush in this case gives me more ability to be loose and to achieve different brush strokes all over these cherry blossoms. So in this painting I am mixing two different types of flowers that are very different in size and in shapes. So this is something that I wanted to remind you. When you are painting a floral composition in loose style, remember to add different components that have different sizes and different colors. Also, different techniques can be mixed together. For example, in this case, I'm using this technique where I am creating these C shapes and just dots to create ruffled edges of these cherry blossoms. And they are next to these peonies that have large petals all over the center. In this way, you will create a sort of movement in the painting, and it's going to be very nice for the observer to look at your work. At this point, with this mop brush, I take a little bit of green, this is Green Earth, and I mix it with a little bit of Sap Green on my color palette to add a few leaves on the cherry blossoms. If you look at the reference picture of a cherry blossom, you will notice that there are a few small leaves that are connected to these branches and are also next to the flowers. So using this mop brush and just the very tip of this brush and not so much pressure, I'm creating these very loose style leaves. With the same brush, I use a similar mixture of greens to add definitions to the leaves of the peonies. Therefore, I started to create a second layer on the leaves too. As I was proceeding with this composition, I have decided to change into a round brush in size 6 to add more brush strokes into the leaves. And so I'm using a mixture of mainly green and magenta, so this sort of dark green, but still quite bright, to add a few brush strokes on the big leaves of these peonies. I'm using just the tip of my brush, and so all of these strokes are very fine. When I'm happy with the leaves, I just use a little bit of yellow lemon dip, and I mix it with the green that I have on my color palette, and I started to create the center of these peonies. The center is a round disc in this yellow-green color that I'm creating with the very tip of this round brush, and I proceed in the same way creating the disc of the second peony too. I take then a little bit of yellow from my color palette where I add a little bit of magenta, and with this sort of brown where I mix a little bit of yellow ochre too, I create all the pistils around the yellow center of the two peonies. Basically, I am trying to create these pistils through fine lines that are in a darker color, a color that quite pops from the yellow that I have created for the petals. For this reason, I have added a little bit of magenta and a very little touch of Scarlet Lake to create this sort of warm yellow that is quite different from the yellow of the petals that I've created in first place. With the tip of this brush, I am creating also a few dots to highlight the end of these pistils. I add similar brush strokes also to the second peony, and we have actually reached the end of this tutorial. I hope this tutorial was useful for you to understand how to add layers to your flowers, how to put together different types of flowers of different shapes and colors, and overall I hope you had fun. I hope to see you in the next video.